All right, we are continuing by talking about the thyroid gland, a really important gland for our metabolism. So the thyroid gland is a butterfly-shaped gland that is located over the larynx and upper portion of the trachea, which is higher up in our throat. The larynx is what contains our vocal cords and some other structures. We'll learn about that when we do the respiratory system later in the semester in lab and in lecture. And it is going to, again, be stimulated by that thyroid stimulating hormone coming from the anterior pituitary gland. So we are going to get signaled by that TSH from the anterior pituitary gland, and that is going to produce something called thyroglobulin, which is the precursor to the two thyroid hormones that get produced, T3 and T4. T3 is triiodothyronine, and then T4 is thyroxine. And so the difference between those is how many iodines are attached to that molecule. T3 has 3 iodines, T4 has 4 iodines. And so that thyroglobulin is going to be able to get converted into either T3 or T4. And those are generally going to be bound to special transport proteins called thyroxine binding globulins, or TBGs, albumin or other plasma proteins, and that basically just kind of prevents them from just freely entering any cell that they want to, and guarantees that they are getting specifically to the cells that they need to be in. And so the thyroid hormone regulation is a negative feedback loop. That's how we're regulating it. So our first step there is going to be that metabolic rate, or the concentrations of those thyroid hormones. If the concentration in the blood is too low, then that kind of signals to the hypothalamus that our metabolism is getting a little slow, or we're at risk of getting to that point. So the hypothalamus is going to release that thyroid releasing hormone, which is going to trigger the anterior pituitary gland to release that thyroid stimulating hormone, the TSH. That is going to act on the actual thyroid follicle cells there to release T3 and T4. And those T3 and T4 hormones are going to bind to those proteins and get to their target cells. And then they are going to increase basal metabolic rate, so the manufacturing of energy sources, and that can increase body temperature a little bit. This is not going to be a dramatic increase normally, unless there is an abnormally high level of these being produced, which can happen, but generally speaking, you're not going to really notice this rise in body temperature at all. And then that increase in body temperature and basal metabolic rate, and then those higher levels of T3 and T4 are going to end up kind of signaling back to the hypothalamus that, hey, we have enough, stop producing all of this, and then the hypothalamus will stop producing that thyroid releasing hormone, which stops the rest of the cascade. And so that's where we're going with that high here. So then the hypothalamus stops the thyroid releasing hormone, which triggers the anterior pituitary to stop TSH production and release, and therefore that stops that T3 and T4 release further down the line. So this is how that negative feedback system loops. So as those levels increase, they are negatively impacting that signaling pathway to make sure that we don't get too much of those hormones, because that can cause some issues. Generally speaking, T3 is a lot more potent than T4, so a lot of cells will convert T4 to T3 by removing one of those iodine atoms. And so we do still need that T4, but not as much of it. And so the thyroid hormones are our metabolic hormones, and they are going to, again, increase that basal metabolic rate. Basal metabolic rate is our body's function and production of energy and stuff like that while we are at rest. So this is kind of our baseline level of what our cells are doing, even when we're sleeping and stuff like that, is that basal metabolic rate. And obviously that's going to increase when our energy usage increases when we're exercising and stuff like that. So that T3 and T4 actually binds to receptors on the mitochondria, more nutrient breakdown, more use of oxygen, all that kind of stuff. Thyroid hormones are also really, really important for protein synthesis and fetal development, as well as childhood growth and development. They're really, really important for the nervous system to develop properly, both in utero and in early childhood. And they even help support a lot of neurological function in adults. And so there's specific symptoms associated with thyroid disorders that do impact the nervous system. And so those are some really key symptoms to look for. So they're affecting a lot. So they can also interact with reproductive hormones, which can influence sex drive, fertility, all that kind of stuff. It can also increase our sensitivity to things like epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal gland. So this is a big, big impact. So if we have too much T3 and T4, blood pressure is going to go up, heart rate's going to increase, heartbeat's going to get a lot stronger. And so that can be really, really uncomfortable. So thyroid disorders have very, very widespread and usually severe consequences because of how much it is impacting our basal metabolic rate, and that is going to impact literally every part of our body. So iodine deficiencies are one possible cause of thyroid issues. And so iodine is essential for creating T3 and T4, but in a lot of the world, food does not provide adequate levels of iodine. And so in a lot of places, it has been artificially added to certain food products, like salt specifically. So iodized salt is a good source of iodine. But too little dietary iodine is going to prevent the synthesis of T3 and T4. And so that is going to cause that negative feedback loop to not function. So we are going to have those chronically low levels of T3 and T4, which is going to cause the hypothalamus to release more of that TRH and the pituitary gland to release more TSH in an attempt to try to increase those thyroid hormone levels, the T3 and T4. And it's just going to keep going because we're trying to get those levels up. And that can lead to something called a goiter. And so what this is an abnormal growth of the thyroid gland tissue because it is overproducing and getting so overstimulated by that thyroid stimulating hormone in an attempt to get those T3 and T4 levels up. It is really causing that tissue to overgrow. Goiters can frequently be the only visible indication of deficiencies. There's some other indications of iodine deficiency, but they're not always as obvious. And a goiter can also happen due to other causes of low levels of T3 and T4. And so iodine deficiency is not the only one. So inflammation of the thyroid gland is the other common cause of those low levels of T3 and T4. That is called hypothyroidism. Hypo means low. Hypothyroidism is a low metabolic rate, so we're not digesting food and breaking it down as efficiently as possible. That's going to lead to a lot of weight gain. The extremities, so fingers, hands, toes, feet, stuff like that are going to be really, really cold because, again, that increased basal metabolic rate is going to increase body temperature. So if we're having that really low metabolic rate, then it's going to be really, really cold. It can also cause constipation, issues with the reproductive system, menstrual cycle irregularities, stuff like that. And it's also going to have an effect on the brain. So a lot of brain fog and kind of not really being able to think very clearly are key symptoms of hypothyroidism. Easily treatable with some synthetic T3 and T4. People usually make some good improvements once they've figured out the correct dosage for them. On the flip side, there is hyperthyroidism. So these are going to be abnormally elevated levels of these thyroid hormones. This can often be caused by a pituitary or thyroid tumor. So that issue with the tumors is that they're going to mess up all of that signaling and everything. Another common cause is an autoimmune reaction. This is called Graves' disease, and so there are antibodies in the body that get produced that are going to stimulate the thyroid gland to increase the production of T3 and T4. So that signaling is not coming from TSH entirely. That's still happening, but it is coming from these other antibodies that are not supposed to be there. And so that is going to try to trigger that negative feedback loop, and we're going to stop TRH and TSH production, but then we're still getting those thyroid hormones being produced because the thyroid gland's being stimulated by those antibodies. There is another condition that can cause issues called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. That is going to lead to hypothyroidism. That is because the antibodies are attacking the glands of the thyroid and destroying them, and so they are less able to produce T3 and T4 in adequate levels. But coming back to hyperthyroidism, that's obviously going to increase metabolism, which can lead to people feeling really, really, really hot, so excess body heat, a lot of sweating, diarrhea, massive amounts of weight loss. This is not just like 5 or 10 pounds in a couple months' time. This is like 20 pounds in 2 or 3 weeks kind of weight loss, like really, really dramatic, dangerous levels of weight loss. It can also cause tremors, so a lot of shakiness, increased heart rate. It can also cause bulging eyes, as those antibodies produce a lot of inflammation. So T3, T4, controlling that metabolism. Thyroid gland is also going to produce something called calcitonin, which is going to reduce blood calcium levels. Oops, thought I had another slide. So we won't talk too much about calcitonin, but touching on that a little bit, this is being produced by parafollicular cells. These are slightly different types of thyroid cells. It's going to get released when blood calcium levels increase to pull that excess calcium out of the bloodstream, and it's going to help get that deposited into bone cells and stuff like that, so that we are not getting too high levels of calcium in the blood. So it can inhibit the activity of osteoclasts, which are going to break down that bone and release calcium into circulation because they're breaking down bone. So inhibiting that activity is going to help reduce those blood calcium levels. It can also increase bone building activity by the osteoblasts. It can decrease calcium absorption in the intestines, so telling the intestines we don't need to absorb as much calcium right now, and also decreasing calcium reabsorption in the kidneys, which is going to make us secrete more of that calcium through the urine. These are not always going to dramatically affect blood calcium levels, interestingly. The entire importance of calcitonin is not clearly understood at this point in time, so there's still a lot of research going into why calcitonin is so important. Why are we expending energy and resources to make this hormone? There has to be some sort of really big benefit for the body to be going through all of that work to make calcitonin. But exactly how it works and all of its other interactions are not clearly understood at this particular point in time. But obviously, calcium is still really important. We want enough calcium levels in the blood. As we saw last week with muscles, it's really, really important for those muscle contractions. But we do still need to balance that out as best as possible. And we'll continue our next video with the parathyroid glands.